Sometimes the most expensive mistake a man can make isn't losing his money. It's losing the people who once loved him for free. Ethan Walker stared at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Manhattan conference room, while 12 executives waited for his decision on a deal worth nearly $4 billion. Rain hammered against the glass 70 stories above the city, but inside the room, nobody spoke. Ethan's sharp gray suit, his cold expression, and the gold watch on his wrist made him look untouchable, like the kind of billionaire people feared disappointing. At 39 years old, he had built one of the biggest tech companies in America, owned homes in 3 states, and appeared on magazine covers beside words like visionary and genius. But none of that mattered when his phone suddenly vibrated against the polished table. Ethan almost ignored it. Unknown number. He reached to silence the call before his eyes caught the voicemail preview appearing on the screen. Then his entire body froze. Mr. Walker, this is St. Mary's Children's Hospital in Boston. Your son has been admitted to the emergency room. You need to come immediately. The room around him disappeared. Ethan blinked once, convinced he had heard wrong. His son. His breathing slowed into a dangerous silence as every executive watched the color drain from his face. Ethan had not heard that word spoken to him in over a year. Son. He stood so quickly that his chair rolled backward across the marble floor. Cancel the meeting, he muttered. Nobody moved. Nobody had ever seen Ethan Walker shaken before. Now. Within seconds he grabbed his coat and walked out, his heart pounding harder with every step toward the elevator. Rain exploded across the streets outside as his driver rushed to open the car door, but Ethan barely noticed. One thought kept replaying in his mind. Claire. Claire Bennett. The woman who disappeared from his life 1 year ago carrying a baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket. The woman he convinced himself would eventually come back. The woman he failed. Traffic crawled through the wet streets while flashes of memory hit him harder than the storm outside. Claire standing near the penthouse doorway with tears in her eyes. Tiny Noah asleep against her shoulder. The trembling sound of her voice when she whispered, "One day, Ethan, you're going to realize money can't hold a family together." Back then, Ethan had stayed silent. Pride was easier than vulnerability. Work was easier than love. He remembered watching her walk away into the rain while convincing himself she was overreacting. But she never returned. At first, Ethan expected a phone call. Then a text. Weeks passed. Then months. Eventually, the silence became punishment. Yet somehow, despite everything, Claire had listed him as the emergency contact at the hospital. The realization hit Ethan harder than guilt itself. Out of everyone in the world, when something terrible happened, Claire still called him. As the black SUV sped toward the private airport, Ethan stared at the rain sliding down the window and felt fear for the first time in years. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of failure. Fear of being too late. The private jet landed in Boston just after midnight, but Ethan barely remembered the flight. During the entire trip, he sat alone staring at the city lights beneath the clouds while memories of Claire replayed in painful fragments. He remembered the first time he met her at a charity event in Chicago nearly 3 years earlier. Claire Bennett had not looked impressed by his wealth, his fame, or the cameras following him around the ballroom. While everyone else tried to gain something from Ethan Walker, Claire treated him like an ordinary man. She laughed at his bad jokes. She challenged his opinions. She looked at him in a way no one else had in years. Like he was human instead of a headline. That was what terrified him most. By the time Noah was born, Ethan had already convinced himself he could balance both worlds. Billionaire CEO by day. Secret family behind closed doors. But Claire slowly realized she and Noah would always come second to his empire. Ethan still remembered the night everything broke apart. His mother had organized a formal dinner at the Walker estate in Connecticut, inviting politicians, investors, and wealthy friends. Claire wore a soft cream-colored dress and held baby Noah in her arms while trying to smile through the tension. Ethan promised her the evening would be different. He promised his family would finally accept them. Instead, his mother barely acknowledged Claire the entire night. At one point, Ethan overheard her quietly telling a guest, "That woman and her child are becoming a distraction for Ethan's future." Claire heard it too. Ethan saw the hurt in her eyes immediately, but instead of defending her, he stayed silent because investors were nearby. Because cameras were nearby. Because protecting his image had become instinct. Later that night, Claire stood inside the penthouse nursery while Noah slept against her shoulder. The city lights glowed behind her, but her face looked exhausted, like someone who had spent too long hoping for a miracle. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she asked softly. Ethan loosened his tie and avoided her eyes. "Claire, not tonight. You keep asking me to wait for the right moment, the right announcement, the right time for your family to accept us. But Noah is already 1 year old, Ethan." Her voice cracked slightly. "How long are we supposed to stay hidden?" Ethan tried to explain that the company was preparing for a major merger, and the press attention would create problems. He told himself he was protecting them from media chaos. But Claire no longer believed him. "You love us in private," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "But you are ashamed of us in public." Ethan immediately denied it, yet deep down he knew why her words hurt so much. Because part of him feared she was right. Claire walked toward the doorway carrying Noah while rain poured against the windows outside. Ethan expected her to calm down by morning like every other argument they survived before. But then she stopped near the front door and looked back one final time. "One day, your company will not matter nearly as much as this moment," she said quietly. Ethan did not follow her. He let pride keep him frozen in place while the elevator doors closed between them forever. Now, 1 year later, as Ethan rushed through the bright hospital hallway in Boston, the weight of that decision crushed him harder than any business failure ever could. And when he finally reached the emergency floor, he saw Claire sitting alone beside the waiting room window with tears silently running down her face. For a few seconds Ethan could not move. Claire sat beneath the cold hospital lights wearing a faded gray sweater and jeans that looked worn from endless use. Nothing like the elegant woman who once stood beside him in Manhattan penthouses and luxury hotels. Her blonde hair was tied back carelessly, dark circles shadowed her tired eyes, and her hands trembled around a paper coffee cup that had already gone cold. Yet despite how exhausted she looked, Ethan noticed the same thing he always remembered about Claire. Even broken, she carried herself with quiet strength. She slowly lifted her eyes toward him, and the shock on her face quickly hardened into disbelief. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. Ethan struggled to answer. His chest tightened at the sound of her voice after an entire year of silence. "The hospital called me," he said carefully. "They said Noah was here." Claire looked away immediately, guilt flashing across her face. "I should not have put your number down." Ethan stepped closer. "Claire, what happened?" Before she could answer, the emergency room doors opened and a doctor walked toward them holding a clipboard. "Are you family?" the doctor asked. Claire nodded first. "I am his mother." Then, after a painful pause, Ethan quietly added, "I am his father." Hearing those words aloud made something inside him crack. The doctor explained that Noah had experienced severe breathing complications connected to an underlying heart condition. Ethan felt his stomach drop as the doctor continued speaking about tests, oxygen levels, and possible surgery consultations. Heart condition. Ethan stared at Claire in complete confusion. "What is he talking about?" he asked softly once the doctor walked away. Claire closed her eyes for a moment as if she no longer had the strength to hide the truth. "Noah was diagnosed 8 months ago," she admitted. Ethan could barely process the sentence. 8 months. His voice lowered dangerously, not with anger but disbelief. "You never told me our son was sick?" Claire's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "I tried." Ethan froze. "What do you mean you tried?" Claire reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out an old phone with a cracked screen. She opened her email inbox and turned the screen toward him. Ethan saw dozens of unsent draft messages addressed to him. Some were short. Some were several pages long. One subject line read, "Noah had another episode tonight." Another said, "I do not know what to do anymore." Ethan felt sick. "Why did you never send them?" Claire looked down at the floor. "Because every time I almost did, I remembered your mother telling people Noah was a distraction to your future." Ethan swallowed hard. Claire continued quietly, "I was terrified they would take him from me. Your family has money, lawyers, power. I had nothing except Noah." The silence between them became unbearable. Somewhere down the hallway, A machine beeped steadily while rain tapped softly against the hospital windows. Ethan suddenly realized Claire had been carrying this nightmare alone for nearly a year. Doctor appointments, bills, sleepless nights, fear. And while she was struggling to keep their son healthy, he had been standing on magazine covers pretending success meant happiness. "Claire," he whispered painfully, "why did you not ask me for help?" She finally looked directly into his eyes, and the sadness there hit harder than any accusation ever could. "Because the last time I needed you," she said softly, "you let me walk away." Claire's words stayed trapped inside Ethan's mind long after the conversation ended. "Because the last time I needed you, you let me walk away." He had faced billion-dollar lawsuits, ruthless competitors, and reporters waiting for him to fail, but nothing had ever made him feel smaller than standing in that hospital hallway beside the woman he once claimed to love. For the first time in years, Ethan did not know how to defend himself. A nurse finally approached and told Claire she could briefly see Noah before another round of tests. Claire immediately stood up, but before following the nurse, she hesitated. Ethan saw the conflict in her expression: anger, fear, exhaustion. Then quietly, without looking directly at him, she whispered, "You can come too." Ethan followed her through the silent hallway, every step heavier than the last. When they entered the room, Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. Little Noah lay asleep beneath pale hospital blankets, tiny tubes attached near his nose while a monitor softly beeped beside the bed. The small boy looked even tinier surrounded by machines and bright white lights. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. 1 year. One entire year gone. Noah's blonde hair had grown slightly longer, and his face looked thinner than Ethan remembered. But the moment Ethan saw the child's eyes slowly open, his heart nearly shattered. Gray eyes, exactly like his own. Noah looked weak and confused as he glanced toward the unfamiliar man standing near the doorway. Claire gently brushed her fingers through Noah's hair. "Sweetheart," she whispered softly, "this is your dad." Ethan felt emotion hit him so suddenly he had to grip the side of the chair beside him. "Dad." Noah blinked slowly, studying Ethan with innocent curiosity. Then in a tiny tired voice he asked, "Are you staying this time?" The question destroyed whatever emotional walls Ethan still had left. Claire immediately looked away, her eyes filling with tears again, while Ethan struggled to answer. "Yeah," he whispered hoarsely. "I am staying." Noah gave a faint nod before drifting back to sleep moments later, completely unaware that his simple question had just broken a billionaire who once believed emotions were weaknesses. Ethan sat beside the bed in silence while Claire stepped outside to speak with another doctor. Alone in the room, Ethan finally noticed the details he had been too blind to see before. The worn backpack sitting beside Claire's chair. The stack of unpaid medical envelopes partially hidden beneath her coat. The cheap motel key resting on the table near an empty vending machine coffee cup. Claire had not been living comfortably. She had been surviving. Ethan slowly opened one of the envelopes and saw medical charges stretching across multiple pages. Specialist appointments, medication costs, cardiology exams, numbers circled in red ink. His chest tightened painfully. This woman had spent nearly a year carrying their sick child through hospitals while working enough jobs to keep them alive. And he never even knew. Worse than that, he never tried hard enough to know. Ethan leaned back in the chair and covered his face with his hands. Memories flooded his mind all at once. The nights Claire begged him to spend more time at home. The mornings she ate breakfast alone while he answered business calls. The way Noah used to reach toward him as a baby while Ethan rushed out the penthouse door promising he would make it up later. Later never came. Suddenly the room felt unbearably quiet except for the steady sound of Noah's heartbeat monitor. Ethan looked at his sleeping son again and realized something terrifying. For all his money, power, and success, none of it could erase the possibility that he might lose the only family he truly loved. Hours passed inside the hospital room while rain continued falling over Boston like the city itself refused to sleep. Claire sat curled up in the chair beside Noah's bed, occasionally brushing her fingers against his small hand whenever the monitors beeped too loudly. Ethan remained near the window in silence, his expensive suit wrinkled now, his tie loosened, looking less like a billionaire and more like a man finally facing the damage he created. Sometime after 3 in the morning, Noah woke again. His eyes looked tired, but this time he focused directly on Ethan. "Mom says you build computers," Noah said softly. Ethan blinked, surprised by the sudden comment. "Something like that," he answered quietly, moving closer to the bed. Noah studied him carefully for a moment. "Are you rich?" Claire immediately looked uncomfortable. "Noah," she whispered gently. But Ethan gave a small sad smile. "Yeah," he admitted. Noah nodded slowly as if processing something important in his little mind. Then he asked the question Ethan was completely unprepared for. "If you are rich, why do we live in motels sometimes?" The room fell silent. Claire lowered her head instantly, humiliated by the truth she worked so hard to hide. Ethan felt. Every word hit him like a punch to the chest. He looked around the hospital room again and suddenly understood details he had ignored before. Claire's shoes were worn at the edges. Her phone screen was cracked badly enough that tape covered one corner. Even the backpack beside her chair looked faded from constant travel. This was not temporary struggle. This was survival. "Noah," Claire said softly, forcing a smile through her exhaustion, "you do not need to worry about grown-up things." But Noah continued innocently, "Mom works all the time. Sometimes she cries when she thinks I am asleep." Ethan closed his eyes for one painful second. Claire quickly stood and kissed Noah's forehead. "Sweetheart, try to get some rest, okay?" Noah nodded weakly and slowly drifted back to sleep again. The moment he fell asleep, Claire quietly walked out into the hallway. Ethan followed her a few seconds later and found her standing beside a vending machine fighting back tears. "Claire," he began carefully, but she shook her head immediately. "Please do not." Her voice trembled. "I already feel embarrassed enough." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "Embarrassed? Claire, you kept our son alive by yourself for a year." She laughed bitterly through tears. "Barely." Ethan moved closer. "Why were you staying in motels?" Claire crossed her arms tightly as if trying to hold herself together. "Because apartments require deposits, credit checks, stability." She wiped her eyes quickly. "I worked at a diner during the mornings and cleaned offices at night while Noah stayed with an older woman downstairs whenever she could help." Ethan felt physically sick listening to her describe a life he never imagined she was living. "Claire, why did you not take the money from the account I left open for you?" Her expression hardened instantly. "Because I needed to know I could survive without depending on someone who was ashamed to claim us." Ethan looked down at the floor, unable to argue. Claire continued softly. "You know what the worst part was? Noah asked about you all the time." Ethan swallowed painfully. "What did you tell him?" Claire looked back through the hospital room window at their sleeping son. "I told him his father was probably too busy saving the world to realize his own family was falling apart." Ethan had spent years believing success meant providing everything money could buy. But standing there beside Claire in that quiet hospital hallway, he finally understood the truth. His absence had cost far more than money could ever repair. Just before sunrise, a cardiologist entered Noah's room holding several scan results and asked to speak privately with Claire and Ethan. The tension in the doctor's expression immediately made Claire nervous. Ethan watched her fingers tighten around the edge of the chair, while they followed the doctor into a small consultation office down the hallway. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, and the fluorescent lights above made everyone look exhausted. The doctor sat across from them and carefully explained that Noah's condition had worsened more quickly than expected. His heart would likely require a specialized surgery within the next few weeks. Without treatment, the complications could become life-threatening. Claire lowered her head the moment she heard the word surgery, as though she had already spent months fearing this exact conversation. Ethan immediately asked for the best specialists available in the country. The doctor nodded slowly. "There is a pediatric cardiac surgeon in New York who has had excellent outcomes with cases like Noah's," he explained. "But the waiting list is extremely competitive." Ethan barely hesitated. "I will personally make the calls." Claire suddenly spoke before the doctor could respond. "No." Ethan turned toward her in confusion. "What do you mean no?" Claire looked emotionally drained, but there was stubborn strength behind her eyes. "I do not want Noah becoming some publicity story connected to your company or your family." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. "Claire, this is not about business anymore." "Maybe not for you," she whispered painfully, But I spent the last year protecting him from that world. The doctor quietly excused himself, sensing the tension between them. The moment the door closed, Ethan lowered his voice. You still think I care more about appearances than Noah? Claire folded her arms tightly. I think your world destroys anything vulnerable. Ethan wanted to argue, but deep down he knew she had reasons to feel that way. Claire reached into her purse again and pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked worn from being opened too many times. She handed it to him silently. Ethan unfolded it and immediately felt his chest tighten. It was a pawnshop receipt dated 6 months earlier. Attached to it was a picture of Claire wearing a delicate silver necklace he remembered clearly. Her late mother's necklace. Claire noticed the recognition in his face. That necklace was the only thing I had left from my mom, she said softly. I sold it to pay for Noah's medication during the winter. Ethan could not speak. Claire continued quietly. There were nights I sat awake praying Noah would not get sick because I did not know if I could afford another hospital bill. Ethan looked at the receipt again and realized the amount she received for the necklace was less than what he once spent on a single dinner with investors. Shame flooded through him so hard he could barely breathe. Claire, his voice cracked for the first time. Why did you go through all of this alone? Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she forced herself to stay composed. Because every time I thought about asking for help, I remembered standing in your penthouse while your mother treated Noah like a problem that needed to disappear. Ethan closed his eyes in pain. Claire looked away toward the small hospital window. I could survive being hurt by you, she whispered. But I could not survive watching our son grow up feeling unwanted. Ethan stared at her silently, realizing she had spent the last year sacrificing pieces of herself just to protect Noah emotionally as much as physically. In that moment, Ethan understood something that terrified him more than losing his company, his reputation, or his fortune. Claire had become strong enough to live without him. That night, Claire finally fell asleep beside Noah's hospital bed after nearly 40 hours without real rest. Ethan noticed the exact moment exhaustion overcame her. 1 second she was trying to stay awake while holding Noah's tiny hand, and the next her eyes slowly closed as her head rested against the edge of the mattress. The sight nearly broke him all over again. Claire had always been strong, but now her strength looked worn down by survival. Ethan quietly took off his suit jacket and carefully draped it over her shoulders without waking her. Then he sat alone in the chair near the window while the city lights flickered outside against the dark Boston skyline. For the first time in years, there were no assistants calling him, no investors demanding meetings, no reporters asking questions. Just silence. And in that silence, Ethan finally had nothing left to distract him from his own guilt. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His company board had sent more than 30 messages asking where he was. His assistant warned him that investors were furious because he missed the merger announcement in New York that morning. Normally, Ethan would have considered it a disaster. Instead, he muted the entire phone without reading another word. None of it mattered anymore. Ethan leaned back in the chair and stared at Noah sleeping peacefully beside Claire. Then, almost without thinking, he opened an old folder hidden deep in his phone gallery. Hundreds of pictures filled the screen. Claire laughing in a kitchen while flour covered her cheeks. Baby Noah wrapped in a blue blanket during his first snowstorm. Tiny fingerprints pressed against penthouse windows overlooking Manhattan. Ethan had secretly kept every photo. Even after Claire disappeared, he could never delete them. Some nights he would sit alone in his empty penthouse scrolling through those pictures while pretending he did not miss them. But tonight the loneliness felt unbearable. Ethan noticed a voicemail file saved near the bottom of the folder. The date showed it was recorded almost 11 months earlier. His chest tightened as he pressed play. Claire's voice filled the quiet hospital room softly. Hey, it is me. Noah said his first real word today. Ethan closed his eyes instantly. Claire gave a tiny laugh through the recording. Actually, he tried to say, your name. It sounded more like an, but I think it still counts. Her voice became quieter after a pause. I know you are busy. I know maybe you are angry with me. But I just thought, maybe you would want to know. The voicemail ended there. Ethan stared at the dark phone screen while emotion crashed into him harder than ever before. Claire had called him. Even after everything. Even after he failed her. She still wanted him involved in Noah's life. And he never listened to the message because his assistant filtered unknown calls during that period to avoid distractions before the company merger. Ethan suddenly covered his face with one hand as tears finally escaped despite every attempt to stop them. Years of pressure, pride, and emotional distance collapsed at once in that silent hospital room. Ethan Walker, the billionaire admired by millions, sat alone crying beside the family he nearly lost because he spent too long believing success could replace presence. A soft voice interrupted his thoughts moments later. "Dad." Ethan looked up quickly and saw Noah awake again, his tired gray eyes watching him carefully. Ethan immediately wiped his face, embarrassed to be seen crying. But Noah simply gave him a small sleepy smile. "It is okay," he whispered softly. "Mom cries sometimes too." Ethan felt his heart shatter completely as Noah reached his tiny hand toward him for the very first time. The next morning, Ethan left the hospital before sunrise and made a series of phone calls that changed everything. Within hours, one of the top pediatric cardiac surgeons in New York personally reviewed Noah's medical files. By noon, a private medical transport team was preparing for Noah's transfer to a specialized children's hospital in Manhattan. Ethan used every connection, every favor, and every resource he had built over 2 decades in business, but for the first time in his life, he was not doing it to grow richer or more powerful. He was doing it because a little boy with gray eyes had reached for his hand and called him Dad. Claire stood near the hospital window while nurses prepared Noah for transport. She looked overwhelmed by how quickly everything suddenly moved. Ethan approached carefully. "The surgeon believes Noah has an excellent chance if the procedure happens soon," he explained softly. Claire nodded, but her expression remained guarded. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan hesitated before answering. "You do not have to thank me for helping my son." Claire looked down for a moment. "You keep saying that like it comes naturally now." Ethan felt the weight behind her words immediately. She still did not trust him. Maybe she could not. Before Ethan could respond, his phone rang again. He glanced at the screen and saw his mother's name. Claire noticed instantly and turned away without saying anything. Ethan answered reluctantly. "Mother." Her voice sounded cold and irritated. "Where have you been? The board members are furious. Investors are asking questions." Ethan stared through the hospital glass at Noah sleeping peacefully while nurses adjusted his blankets. "I am with my son." Silence filled the line for 2 full seconds. Then his mother spoke carefully. "Ethan, do not let emotions destroy everything you built." Something inside Ethan finally snapped. "Everything I built?" he repeated quietly. "You mean the company I spent years prioritizing while my family fell apart?" His mother lowered her voice. "That woman chose to leave." Ethan's expression hardened instantly. "No. Claire left because I failed to stand beside her." The silence on the other end became tense. Ethan continued before she could interrupt. "You made her feel unwanted from the beginning, and I let it happen because I cared too much about appearances." His mother sounded shocked. "Ethan, no," he said firmly. "I spent a year pretending my success mattered more than the people who loved me. I am done living that way." Then, for the first time in his adult life, Ethan hung up on his mother. Claire slowly turned back toward him after overhearing enough to understand what happened. She looked stunned. Ethan slid his phone into his pocket and exhaled deeply, as though cutting that emotional cord had physically exhausted him. "You did not have to do that," Claire whispered. Ethan met her eyes. "Yes, I did." Claire searched his face carefully, trying to decide whether the man standing in front of her was truly different from the one who watched her leave a year ago. Before she could speak again, Noah stirred weakly on the hospital bed. "Mom," he mumbled sleepily. Claire immediately walked over and kissed his forehead. Noah blinked slowly before looking toward Ethan. "Are we going to New York together?" Ethan walked closer and gently took Noah's tiny hand again. "Yeah, buddy," he said softly. "Together." Noah smiled faintly and squeezed Ethan's hand with surprising trust. Claire watched the moment silently, but despite everything Ethan had done to hurt her, she could feel something dangerous happening inside her heart. For the first time in a very long time, she wanted to believe him. 3 months later, the first warm days of spring finally reached New York City. Sunlight poured through the large apartment windows while the smell of pancakes drifted softly from the kitchen. Noah sat at the dining table coloring superheroes with serious concentration, occasionally humming to himself while a small scar beneath his shirt remained hidden proof of everything he survived. The surgery had been successful. The recovery was slow and exhausting at times, but every doctor who examined Noah now used words Claire had prayed for during countless sleepless nights. Stable. Healthy. Improving. Ethan stood near the stove wearing a simple gray sweater instead of his usual designer suits, while carefully flipping pancakes that Noah insisted always tasted better when his father made them. His company still existed, his wealth still remained, but his priorities no longer looked the same. Ethan had stepped down from several major leadership positions, ignored endless media speculation, and moved into a quieter apartment overlooking the Hudson River, because Noah loved watching the boats pass by every evening. For once in his life, Ethan no longer cared about appearing successful to strangers. He only cared about being present for the people he almost lost forever. Claire leaned silently against the kitchen doorway watching him laugh softly after Noah accidentally covered the table with too much syrup. Moments like this still felt unfamiliar to her. Peace had become something she forgot how to trust. Ethan noticed her standing there and smiled gently. "You okay?" Claire nodded slowly. "I think so." Ethan walked over carefully, his expression softer now than she had ever seen during the years they spent together before. "You still look at me sometimes like you expect me to disappear," he admitted quietly. Claire looked down at her hands. "I spent a long time learning how not to depend on anyone." Ethan understood. He deserved that fear. For a moment, neither of them spoke while sunlight filled the apartment around them. Then Noah suddenly looked up from the table. "Are we still going to the park later?" Ethan smiled immediately. "Absolutely." Noah grinned proudly before returning to his coloring book. Claire watched the interaction and felt emotion tighten in her chest. Noah no longer asked where his father was. He no longer looked disappointed when Ethan missed bedtime because Ethan never missed anymore. He attended every doctor appointment, every therapy session, every ordinary moment that once seemed less important than business meetings. Claire finally realized the biggest difference was not Ethan's money or influence. It was consistency. Ethan turned back toward her after setting a plate on the table. "Claire," he said softly. She met his eyes cautiously. Ethan hesitated like a man terrified of saying the wrong thing. "I know I cannot erase what I put you through. I know there were nights you felt alone because of me." His voice lowered painfully. "But losing you and Noah was the biggest mistake of my life." Claire felt tears sting her eyes immediately. Ethan stepped closer but still gave her space to walk away if she wanted. "I spent years chasing success because I thought providing money made me a good man," he whispered. "But Noah almost died before I understood that love is not measured by what you buy people. It is measured by whether you stay when they need you most." Claire looked toward Noah laughing happily at the table before slowly turning back to Ethan. For the first time in over a year, the fear inside her heart no longer felt stronger than hope. Ethan carefully reached for her hand, and this time Claire did not pull away. Outside the apartment windows, sunlight reflected across the river while inside, for the first time in a very long time, the broken little family finally felt whole again.